Hello, my name is Joanna Grace. I run a thing called the Sensory Projects. The Sensory Projects is all about sharing the knowledge and creativity that you need to use inexpensive resources as effective sensory tools for inclusion. Most of my work focuses on people with profound and multiple learning disabilities, but because of the sensory insights involved, a lot of it also overlaps with the neurodivergent community, where differences in sensory processing are key to the lived experience. This, by the way, is my 4-week-old little assistant, so if he interrupts us, I'm very sorry. What I want to do in this video is just highlight some things that you might want to think about if you're looking to design an inclusive, sensorially inclusive workplace. Before I start to explain, we should note the uniqueness of autistic brains. It's one of the things that comes through in the research around autism over and over again. You can have, like researchers will look at a neurotypical brain and you can describe it and it is, you know, like this. And then they look at the autistic brain and it is different to that. But the way that it is different is not consistent. So one of the defining features of autistic people is their uniqueness. And that's a real challenge if you're designing a space for people who are by definition very unique, because what works for one person won't work for everybody. So I'm going to be talking in general terms, but it's not necessarily going to work in general terms. This is just a starting point for thinking. So generally speaking, visual clutter is a real challenge to people who often experience heightened visual sensitivity. So you can see behind me, nice and plain, you would be looking for plain, muted tones, not busy, you know, lots of notices on a board, that sort of thing. And whilst you're thinking about that stuff, you're thinking about what colours you would go for, and I am going to explain all of this really super quick. If you want a longer explanation or a conversation about it, or if you want to find out more, if you want to explore it a bit further, do come and get in touch with me online, because when he's asleep I'm very happy to have a longer chat, or when he's grown up I'm very happy to have a longer chat. But if you're thinking about colour palettes, your individual response to visual stimulation is partly defined by your neurology, it's partly defined by your personal experience, by your individual preferences, by your sensory differences, but a little bit of it is defined by our experience as a species. So there's this wonderful phrase, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which means that the growth of an individual in the womb mimics the evolution of a species as a whole. And for us as a species, our sight is evolved to be used to natural environments. It's only, you know, in the last few seconds as a species that we've been living in these concrete boxes. So I would look to choose natural tones for those plain, smooth spaces. And actually the design style I take most inspiration from when I'm thinking about designing for neurodivergent audiences is the Danish concept of hygge, Hygge, where you've got a very natural colour palette, but interest is added through providing texture. Another thing to think about with your visual environment is the presence of faces. Your eyes, we are all born, actually it's good that I've got the little assistant with me, we are all born with about 100 reflexes. So currently he has the suck reflex, he has a reflex to blink, he has a reflex to grab. Most of these 100 reflexes wear off in the first 6 months of life, but some of them stay with us through life. And we have a reflex in our eyes for faces. Our faces will not a lot of sleep. Our eyes will reflexively go to faces in the room. We are automatically drawn to them, and it's a survival mechanism, because when you're this small you need to connect with those big faces around you in order to stay safe. But if you're autistic, then face-to-face contact can be very challenging, and eye contact can be challenging, and being asked to be in a space where there's lots of faces, you still will have that reflex that your eyes take you to. That is an invitation to be just a little bit stressed, just a little bit stressed. If I can sit at my workstation and make eye contact with 10 other people, That's a much more challenging environment for me as an autistic person than if I can sit at my workstation and see nobody. And whilst you're thinking about faces, you might also want to think about the demand placed by pictures of faces, because a picture of a face on a wall will also trigger that reflex. And although when you look at it, you're looking at a photo, you're still draining a little bit of that energy. Your eyes are going, oh, face. And every time you're asked to do that, you're putting a little bit of pressure on that person. So when you're thinking about your visual environment, low clutter, natural tones, and avoid faces, and actually screening so that people can have their little private space is a really lovely thing to think about. I've talked about vision because it's our most dominant sense. It takes up like a third of our cerebral cortex. But obviously we have a lot more senses. And whilst you're decluttering vision and you're taking the pressure off vision, you might also want to explore taking the pressure off those other senses. So a key one would be sound. And actually, if you are a busy office place environment and you're looking to employ 1 or 2 autistic members of your team, then you might want to consider offering them something so that they can cope better with that environment. And I have autistic friends whose lives have been changed, and this is not product placement, by the Bose sound cancelling headphones that allow you to, it's in-ear headphones, and essentially you get like a mute button for the world. You don't have to play mute. You can listen to music through them, but you don't have to play music through them. You can mute. I believe they physically play you the sound of silence. So some people really find them transformative, but you can also think about sound insulation and stuff like that. That's 2 senses mentioned ever so quickly. You still want to think about the others. You want to think about smell, you want to think about touch. And I haven't got time to talk to you about those, but there's definitely information out there to go exploring on. If you're thinking about what makes for a sensory environment to be more accessible across the senses, then one of the things to investigate is the development of the senses. There are sensory experiences that we can process very early on. Again, I refer to my little assistant. Currently, he can see, hang on, look, black and white. And he might be able to pick up some red tones, but he's not seeing in colour, he's not processing shapes. As he develops, he will take in more and more information visually. And so all of our senses have this progression through them. If you think of it like a curriculum, you know, if I was going to teach you maths, I would teach you to count, and then I would teach you to add, and then I'd teach you to multiply, and we would develop it up like this. The things that are at the start of that curriculum are the easiest for us to do. So if I asked you to count all day, fine. If I asked you to do complex algebra all day, not fine, unless you're that sort of person. And it's the same with your senses. If you're creating a sensory environment that is the equivalent of asking somebody to count all day, then they will survive in that environment far more easily than if you create a sensory environment that asks somebody to do complex algebra all day. So learning what the development of each of those sensory systems is and then designing around that is a really useful tool. And this is a plug, but it's also not a plug. So the plug is my book, Sensory Being for Sensory Beings, describes the development of 7 of your sensory systems. So feel free to buy the book. You will make my publishers some money if you do that. If you want to have a chat with me, I will tell you that information for free. That's absolutely fine. I do the work that I do because I want the world to be a more accessible and inclusive place. And if you're motivated to see that change happen too, then I'm more than happy to have a cup of tea on Skype with you or Zoom. Last thing I'm going to tell you about really quickly in case he wakes up is thinking about how to make the workplace accessible as people come into it. So I did some work with a circus last year, and I invite you to look that up. It's called, I think on YouTube, it's the Circus Star Sensory Story, and I can provide you with a link if you get in touch, or maybe a link can be put on this website so that you can see it. But what we're looking at is that when you go into a new environment, you are asked to do a lot of new things sensorially. And if you are not somebody who has heightened sensory perceptions or has sensory differences, you probably won't notice the stuff that's involved here. But for somebody who has got sensory differences, things, even just simple things like the soap in the toilet smelling different to the soap at home, can be a really big ask. And when you're new at a job and you're trying to make your best first impression, if you're also having to deal with all these other little things as well, that's really going to undermine your ability to function at your best, and then that's going to undermine your self-esteem, and you're going to think to yourself, I might not be able to do this, I don't know if I can cope. Over time you would adjust and you would get used to all those sensory differences, and then you would have more capacity to engage in the job. But the kind of hurdle of having to do that at the start point is a big ask. And so one of the things that we can do is we can let people know ahead of time what those sensations are going to be. So the opportunity to come into the office space before you, I keep saying office, you don't necessarily work in an office, to come into the workspace before you have to start working there is one way of doing this. But also things like having a visual tour, not a sort of a visual tour that goes, look at this amazing workplace. No, a really functional visual tour that goes, this is how you would walk to your desk, this is where the toilets are, this is what the toilets look like. Literally, just if you had a camera and you walked through somebody's route through their workplace, that gives you a lot of information about sight and sound right up front. If you can also tell people what soap you use in your soap dispensers, what bleach you clean your toilets with, then somebody who's aware that they might be going to have these issues could practice smelling these smells and processing these things. This is what we eat at lunch. You know, Kelly from accounts always has an egg sandwich. Things like that I would really love to know before I go into a workplace. And I said at the front of this little chat that I run the sensory projects and that my work is around people with profound and multiple learning disabilities. The other thing that's relevant to disclose is that I'm autistic and I have previously struggled in workplace environments. The main thing that I struggled with was the expectation that I would socialise with other members of the team during my break times. And actually my break times are mine to do with what I choose to do with and what I need to do with. And I was very happy to socialise with other members of the team, but doing that at work was like being asked to do 2 jobs at once, and it was very difficult. It was eventually impossible to sustain. So I hope that if you make some of these changes, or if you start to think about some of these things, if you think about the sensory transition into an environment from outside an environment, there's just so much I want to tell you about and not enough time. I mentioned about the Circus Star sensory story. So that was a sensory guide that we produced to a circus experience to let people know ahead of time what that experience would be like. And that's the sort of thing that I was talking about there with the visual tours. You get information about the visual environment, you get information about the auditory environment using a sensory tour, which again I'm very happy to chat to people about, and I'm not selling you stuff because I would help you do this for free, is a useful way of helping people to prepare for a different sensory environment. So I hope this is useful to you. I appreciate it's very gabbled because I'm against the clock and I've not had enough sleep. But essentially what I've talked to you about is that you want to declutter your sensory experience. So I talked about visual clutter at the start, thinking about the sound environment, thinking about providing things to help people cope with sound or creating environments that are insulative, and then think the same way about those other senses. And when you're thinking in the same way about those other senses, you're thinking about developmentally, those early developmental experiences being the least demanding of people generally. And when you're supporting autistic people, there is not really a generally. But generally, you're looking at the early developmental sensory experiences being most accessible. You're thinking about faces in the environment, and you're thinking about how you prepare somebody and inform somebody about what their sensory environment will be. And if you're doing those things and designing in a sensorially sensitive way, then hopefully you will end up with a more inclusive workspace and benefit from the extraordinary focus and dedication and skill set that autistic workers will bring to your environment. Thanks ever so much for listening to me. Do get in contact if you have any questions. Bye for now.